Happy to get started. So my name is John Jordan, and I work for the province of British Columbia. And I'm here with a new friend, Martine Wainstein from Yale University. And I was supposed to be here also with a new friend, Shuli Goodman, who's the executive director of the LF Energy Project, but she wasn't able to make it this time. So hopefully we'll represent some of her ideas and interests along the way. So we're going to talk a bit about our experience, in the climate space, some of the collaborations we're trying to build. We'll dive into a little bit of examples, and I will talk a little bit about provincials, the activities that we're undertaking, a little bit more of a provincial view, and then Martine is going to take a global view, planetary view, as he likes to say. And I think we'll go back and forth a little bit. Yep. And I think we're both very comfortable to take any questions, particularly the audience isn't huge, so if you have questions along the way, I think we're either of us are happy to accommodate.
And while the presentation was around clean growth, I think the framing things around climate and planetary level is a very good framing to thinking about how do we have economic, social growth in a sustainable planet. So, and discussing the roles of the technologies that British Columbia has been incubating, the projects that we've been incubating at Yale, and then hopefully we have some rich base ground for an even richer dialogue with you guys as well. I'm also happy to do an intro around a bit about more what the things that we do at Yale, and but I know that you also have a nice introduction of British Columbia, which is like why am I even here as a province?
So yeah, I thought somehow I can make this work. So I was going to talk a little bit about the context, like why am I talking about this subject, and a little later I'll get into why. As a government, we're making investments in the kind of technology and capabilities that we're doing in the Hyperledger family. So, fundamentally, as a government, BC is very serious about climate and being, encouraging responsible behavior as a jurisdiction itself, and also the actors in our jurisdiction. So we have a very strong partnership with industry through the CleanBC initiative, where there's a variety of incentives to invest in green technologies, and also, we have a carbon tax in BC that is universally applied. There's no escape clause, $30 a ton, I think it is. I'm not the subject matter expert on that, but one of the real privileges of working in the provincial government is I get to work in many different sectors, and so this is one of them. And of course, Canada is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, and in Canada being organized into provinces, the provinces being responsible for energy and jurisdiction, there's a collaboration between the provincial and federal levels as we sort of face the world and the kind of global climate issues that we are part of. So that's the companies that operate in our jurisdiction, are also looking to understand how the Paris Agreement is going to impact their operations over the next, decades. We also are very aware that in order for, our economy to grow, we have to both be responsible about its impact on the climate and on the ground and on the water, and with the peoples, First Nations, and other folks that live in our communities. We want them to thrive and prosper over decades, but at the same time not do that at the expense of the planet. And right now it's difficult for companies to demonstrate how they are working within the context of the BC regulatory environment, and be able to display that to their investors and to their customers. And so investment is diminishing for them, which is putting their long-term health at risk, and sometimes the health of our communities in terms of their economy, because particularly in BC, the small communities, of which there's over 160 small communities, there tend to be single industry towns, and so changes in those structures can be very difficult for families. And so we're observing as a government that there are a number of things going on in the world which are aimed at trying to make this possible, to bring these worlds together. And Martine mentioned a great phrase, like to bring sort of the accounting world together, where we understand how to measure and instrument and be disciplined about how we count things, and bring that into the financial realm and make that understandable from a financial investment. And Martine will talk.
That might be part of our thesis that we start weaving together today.
So this is something we want to sort of investigate. And finally, from a technology point of view, there's we can see some evidence of activities that are occurring in our own sort of Hyperledger community and in the Linux Foundation community at large. I just met Shuli before Christmas, literally because somebody emailed me and said, "Hey, John, you're doing some stuff in the energy space. Have you seen this?" I was like, "Nope." And then later on, I don't actually remember how I stumbled across the Open Climate project, but I did, luckily, and I'm very happy to be here with Martine.
Yeah.
And
we've had already like a couple of meetings with Shuli to explore the intersection between what John's doing at British Columbia, what we've been doing at Yale with this project we've been incubating called Open Climate, and the role of a Linux Foundation Energy to create frameworks and standards and opportunities and pilots. So it's a pity she was not able to come, but it's a glimpse of the type of collaborations that are needed and yet to come.
Yeah, and I would say, I think she might also say that we had hoped we'd be moving faster and have even more to show today, but part of what we're here to learn from and to share is that, building a collaboration it does take a little time. We have to understand each other. We're all on our tracks, and we need to find ways in which our tracks can mingle with each other and find that common space to deliver some positive outcomes for our the people that we're engaged with. So that's a little bit of, I think, what we're going to explore today.
And within that, the beginning of the year, actually, particularly while Davos was happening, the World Economic Forum, we announced the launch of the Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group at Hyperledger. I noticed last year when we were starting to work around climate accounting in the Hyperledger space that there was a lack of a center of gravity around this discussion. And in 2020, and I'll talk a little bit about why 2020 is so important in the climate history, it made a lot of sense to have a space for dialogue. And so we launched this. We had already 2 meetings of the special interest group. So I encourage you, when you go into the wiki of Hyperledger, you'll go into projects, Climate Action SIG, and then you'll be able to see a bit of what's happening there. I'm chairing that with a colleague called Tom Bauman, who's also the chair of the Climate Change Coalition, which is a global network of organizations interested in the intersection between distributed ledger technologies and the climate space.
Right, so it might be a good time for you to talk a bit about the Open Climate project and so forth.
So the Open Innovation Lab is a project that started at Yale 2 years ago with a big vision that there's a huge growth and further transformation of the digital into different aspects of society, and emerging digital technologies like IoT, AI, and blockchain, and mixed reality can have a critical role in our large planetary challenges. But at the same time, probably the most important technology that we have at hand is the power for radical collaboration, as we frame it. And so this kind of led to an open innovation space where we host projects that are particularly kind of, they have bold ideas because they tap directly at a planetary level. And that comes from a framework of being able to map complex systems, identify key leverage points to unleash system transformation, and then design projects to tap into that. And so that's kind of like I know it's quite abstract, but the lens that we use to define which projects we incubate at the lab. And they're not really incubated at the lab, they're incubated at the network where we try to embed ourselves in. And so John is, British Columbia is just an example of one of many networks that we need to be able to work with multiple organizations. And I cannot think of a better place to do these open and neutral collaborations for open protocols, standards, and projects than universities, which need to be really stewards of knowledge, same as government. And so one of the projects there is called Open Climate, and it came from a couple of years ago. My background has been in the energy space, but while I was doing my PhD, I interacted a lot with climate scientists, and I finally was able to wrap my head around the concept of our global planetary carbon budget. The physical amount of space that we have left in our unique atmosphere to keep pumping greenhouse gases. And so that's a single account that everyone has and we have to manage. So thinking of distributed ledger technologies as a group, among one thing is accounting technology, figured, is there a connection that we can make between managing our planetary budget and the role that blockchains and DLTs can have into that? And then it got a lot more complicated when we started bringing in politics, countries, the Paris Agreement, et cetera. So we've been incubating that project ever since, like, can we have a global climate accounting system? I have a couple of slides to show a bit about where we're going, but I think that might be a good intro to pass it back to you to also share about where BC is coming from with the technology.
Sure.
That was kind of like the general intro of why we stumbled into this piece of technology and how we made the connection with climate.
Sure. So my idea here was to kind of like, I'm kind of the micro and Martine's the macro. And what we want to kind of show is that
I'm shorter.
There's a way to, we believe there could be a way to, I call it like instrument the infrastructure with digital trust in such a way that we can do that in sort of small scale, but it scales out to a global context. So I'm sort of considering the things that we're doing about how do we create the trustable, countable things that can be accounted for as we look at managing the global balance, the global carbon balance, which is kind of the idea when I stumbled across, Martine's stuff. I'm like, wow, it uses the word planetary a lot, which I'm really quite, I like. So now, because I am, the work we're doing, we're primarily involved from a Hyperledger point of view, primarily involved in Indy and Aries, which are a little bit different kinds of blockchain and sort of digital trust technology. So I'm going to just quickly, are people familiar with Indy and Aries and sort of the construct of verifiable credentials and stuff? I know there's a few, but maybe I should spend a few minutes just to introduce that because we need a little bit of a working vocabulary.
Yeah, and I think I love your introduction of like how also British Columbia ends up stumbling upon this technology and working around it.
Yeah. So what's a good start here? So I'm going to bring up this this kind of schematic here, and I'll make it a little bigger. So what's quite different about the model of a verifiable credential is that it is a digital object in and of itself, and the origin of it comes from trying to solve sort of digital identity problems. So there was a number of difficult problems that needed to be managed in that context. We wanted to stay away from this kind of world that was introduced back in the mainframe days, the idea of log on. This is kind of a broken concept that leads to the problems that we're experiencing today when we have what I call Mr. Login interfering with our relationships online. And the bigger Mr. Login challenge is that as we discovered that having all these single accounts was difficult, and we thought to ourselves, oh, well, we could federate these services and have single sign-on, we forgot to think about the governance aspects of that. It wasn't part of our mental model because we sort of were scaling out this enterprise view of the world. We'll have this kind of single sign-in context. And so, Mr. Login here is something that resides in some large organizations that have a great deal of insight into our behaviors that maybe we want to sort of mitigate. So this model of the verifiable credential sort of works to mitigate those kinds of risks. And the involvement of a blockchain is sort of at the lower levels where it deals with the basically, and Nathan, who's one of the core designers of this stuff, is here. So, block your ears, but I just kind of talk about it as a public key ring. This is like the place where you discover the public key of the issuers so that you as a verifier can confirm the integrity of the data being presented to you by the holder in the middle. So a very quick high-level view. But this model turns out to be very robust and very applicable to many different scenarios. And so jumping ahead, application of this to this kind of world is if we look at an example of the application of this model to a construct that we're familiar with, like in the financial system, the pink characters there have to do with how we develop trust and how we manage trust in a particular community. So in this case, the MasterCard community. MasterCard has something called a governance framework. This is the rules by which they operate their systems. And each of the actors in that system has also a set of an agreement that they've agreed to. So you have a cardholder agreement. The banks as issuers have a bank agreement with MasterCard, and the merchants have a merchant agreement. To me, when I looked at the Paris Agreement, for example, well, that's a governance framework. It sets out the rules by which the actors are going to act. It's complicated, but each actor has a set of rules and roles to play. And so that's what kind of led me to start thinking that there could be an applicability here. We generalize that kind of into something that we are starting to call the trust over IP stack. And I'm not going to go into the details here. Thursday, we're running a full day workshop, and we'll dive into this in great detail with working code and apps that you can use on your phone to get credentials. It'll be great fun. But the really key thing here is that what we've done is we, together as a community, have said, you know what, governance is a first-class citizen with technology. No technology decisions occur without people being involved and getting coordinated and understanding how to work together. And that's something that had been forgotten in the past, I think. So what does that mean for us in getting back to the climate and the counting? So I can let Martine tell you more interesting things. So again, getting back to the idea of what does government do? Well, what do we do? Well, we're an issuer. That's our core business. And some of the things we do, we issue foundational things, like we issue your identity attributes so they can be recognized by others. And right now you get that in the form of a card usually, but now we're learning how to do that as a digital credential, which is portable, in your control, protects your personal agency, respects your privacy, and yet others can rely on it as truth. We also do that for legal entities. So this is a service that we've built that has all the legal entities in British Columbia issued to it as a credential. This is a demonstration site. We have a production system there's over 1 million entities in it, orgbook.bc.gov.bc.ca. But this one is loaded with some extra credentials that we don't have live yet, which are well permit credentials against the legal entity shell.
Wow.
And so these credentials would emanate from a government agency called the Oil and Gas Commission. So there is a process by which carbon majors, to use Martine's language, but producers, register their assets with the government, and they are able to.
Is that with federal or
this is provincial?
BC? Provincial.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
So Shell as a company has to get permits from the provincial level for every single well, and you're starting to explore how to issue those credentials, leveraging these technology stack.
Exactly. And so the idea here is that in this case, we have a public repository of these permits, which other services can access via an API. And by using an Aries agent, can ask the org book for a verifiable proof of this system, of this well. So I don't know, seems to be a demo gods. Goodness. Stephen, can you text Wade?
Things are happening on the back end.
So the idea here is, for example, and we've done a small POC with a firm where you can ask the org book for this verifiable proof, which you can then embed in a suite of data that includes the volumetrics of the gas in a pipeline. And in that case, that suite of data, which includes the volumetrics and the GPS coordinates of the well as issued by the government, against a credential, legal entity credential issued by the government, can start to do proof of origin. And if we can do proof of origin and we have instrumentation and appropriate calculations, we can add greenhouse gas profiles to this. And that was where the transition to the thing that is countable, that greenhouse gas profile could be certified by the Government of Canada under the Paris Agreement governance framework. And that could then be input to a system that
And then you can, I'm assuming you also thought about connecting IoT devices to be able to do transparent monitoring and reporting around that well, is that correct?
Exactly, like that's not something we're doing yet, but we actually just today on our Aries Cloud Cloud Agent Python channel, we had a fellow asking about how to get Cloud Agent working on a Raspberry Pi. And a Hyperledger intern did it last summer as well and issued a temperature credential. So for sure, what we're interested in working with industry on and academics is embedding this kind of technology right into a device. That device could be authorized to emit a data stream directly to a government regulatory system via its control plane or perhaps directly, depends on the intelligence of the device. And we could know that data stream is authorized by a person who is associated to the organization that's legally registered in the province, and so we can have the full provenance of the data stream, which we can then emit back to them as a permit or license, which they can then use to present to an investor to say, yep, our data came straight from our devices, it was monitored by the government made a determination that we're within the bounds of our permitted emissions or whatever it is. NGOs held us accountable through satellite imagery. And we can prove that we're doing the best we can to produce this fuel or whatever or mineral or whatever it is. So that's kind of the vision that we're trying to work with and, what we're working towards trying to collaborate with.
That started to lead to kind of like our discussions around climate.
Do you want me to get your slides up?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk a little bit about
since my demo broke.
Bigger context. We'll try in a little bit. So I mentioned that part of this project emerged from the thought of the role that distributed ledger technologies or new digital accounting can have in.
Do you want to get big? Yeah, there you go.
Can have at the planetary level. And just to create a leveling playing field, let me just run through the numbers of what climate change means today at 2020. Obviously, we've been ramping our emissions, and 2020 is a critical historical year because it needs to be the year of our peak emissions. So if next year we are already emitting more than this year, we are reducing significantly our chances to meet the Paris Agreement. And the numbers, we have to radically transform our global emissions all the way down to 0 by 2050 and negative all the way to the end of the century. The math for ourselves, for our companies, for our subnational governments and cities, for our countries and the planet as a whole, is to peak emissions by this year, to half our emissions by 2030, have the next amount, so bringing it down to a 75% reduction by 2040, and go to net zero by 2050. Net zero, what it means is that if we emitted something, we should have created a sequestration, an anthropogenic sequestration to balance that out. So that is essentially an accounting framework for credits and debits at a planetary level, but that needs to build from the nested level of we as individuals, companies, provinces, countries. And one of the things that has put me in a sense of urgency in the last year is that degree of robust accounting is actually missing. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is in charge of managing the Paris Agreement, and the timeline that is there is around what's called a global stocktake. Every country put forward a nationally determined contribution, which are more or less ambitious, but those have to be revised every 5 years. The first one, this year we're going to do a revision of the nationally determined contribution in November in Glasgow in COP26, which is the Conference of the Parties. And then in 2023, we do the first one, and then again every 5 years. The level of data orchestration that needs to happen is far from robust. And that just looks at country level. If we want to know what are the global historic emissions or the last reported emissions of a country level, normally we're going to see things that are 2 or 3 years old. So we really lack what I put there, an integrated climate accounting and accountability mechanism, because we are seeing so many non-state actors pledging, but there is actually no framework to keep them accountable. And even ourselves with our personal pledges, a common platform to manage this, and a clear linkage between how robust climate accounting actually has the capacity to unleash unprecedented economic opportunities. So, I'm not going to dive into the detail of what's been the framework that we've been working on, but when I talked about the use of accounting technology to monitor our planetary carbon budget, that's the bottom part. Then we started adding world system registries, is the registration of countries, of cities that keep track of their carbon inventory and how those need to be nested between nation, subnational, and non-state actors. And then finally, a huge opportunity, and I'll show us a dumbed down version of this, or just focusing on the red part, of how do we create certifications of climate action, climate value, whether those are positive or negative, those debits and credits, how those can enter into a more global network climate market, and how that fundamentally needs to unlock climate finance. To just meet the Paris Agreement, we need to put at least $1 trillion a year. And so how do we track every dollar into climate value to make sure that that actually helps us is a huge part of what this project is about. So a simple one is obviously climate action can come in the form of emissions from extraction of fossil fuel from oils or in the process of transportation and then end use. But same as mitigation, so creating clean energy. Michael Casey's in the audience. We met a couple years ago at the MIT Media Lab, and since we've actually been working on a project of how do we certify origin, not of a fossil fuel, but of a green electron, and fit that within a new way of financing solar. That's a good example of mitigation, but it's just one small part of energy, and actually that's been a lot of the discussions we've had with Shuli and LF Energy is how do we understand and create mechanisms to distinguish a green electron from a brown electron, which really requires a lot of accounting at the power system level. But then there's adaptation. Adaptation is, for example, creating more resilience in the face of climate impacts. Those are not measured with carbon, right? This is why we've talked about climate accounting and not just carbon accounting. Monitoring, reporting, and verifying all those actions is complicated, but with a good orchestration of IoT devices, AI, and DLTs, there's ways for digitally transform the process of monitoring, reporting, and verify those actions so that we can assetize those values and they can also even be traded if needed. In fact, a big discussion around the Paris Agreement is around the concept of the international transfer of mitigation outcomes, one country trading another country a positive climate value. So that has led us to start working on what should be the common language at the global level that we should be speaking. What's a common platform of platforms that, I'm going kind of deep into these slides, but one of the key protocols we've been working on with the project called the Spatial Web that has a spatial-based networking protocol that we thought particularly interesting because at the end of the day, one of the key parts of linking non-state actor pledges, so a company, when Microsoft says we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040, how do those account at the national level? How do they fit within the Paris Agreement? You might have heard of the We Are Still In coalition. When Donald Trump announced that it had the intention of moving out of the Paris Agreement, all non-state and subnational actors are a huge part of it. We're like, we want to be in the Paris Agreement. Now the truth is, that's just in word. Their actions are not directly accounted in the Paris Agreement at the moment. So we think that a way to connect that is by understanding that when you retire an asset, which is an actor, through the use of some of your credentials, and the credentials of that action itself, and it's retired means that taking out of the market, then they can be retired at a nested jurisdictional level. And so this is why we talk a bit about nested climate accounting. And even thinking about user interfaces, we work with a Spanish company called Iberdrola, which is one of the biggest renewable energy companies in the world, around doing some pilots and proof of concepts at Yale University. We're based in Connecticut, so we try to do things locally. But it's like, how do we link a solar array, or in this case, they use a fuel cell. We were doing a fuel cell, which actually would require a bit of their certification of origin from the natural gas that comes into the fuel cell. And I think this is almost like a very interesting pilot that we should be diving into, is how do we connect that local into that global level? And I'll leave that there. I don't know.
I wanted to make one point. Oh,
well, this is the kind of the point around the special interest group that we talked about before, is that I hope you get how interesting, important, and exciting this field is. And this led us to almost like a no-brainer. Let's have a special interest group within Hyperledger so that we can discuss how we can leverage multiple technology stacks from the Hyperledger world and the integration with other ones around the concept of climate action and accounting. And we meet every 2 Tuesdays, 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. But you'll find more info in the wiki.
Yeah, so we want to leave a bit of time for some questions, but I wanted to come back to this slide, Martine, because this is the piece that gives me kind of hope. And the reason it gives me hope is because when we talk about the planet and all of this, it can be pretty overwhelming, and but what I think is really interesting, what the opportunity we have here in Hyperledger family and collaborating with other communities in this space is that I think we can work down at this project level. We can work at a company level, we can work at a state level, we can work at a country level. So I have visibility into sort of, provincial, state level, country level things, registries, for example. We can instrument, legal entity registries, permitting registries, and so forth at the, state and national levels, which is part of instrumenting the whole, a complex adaptive system with trust, right? And then if we can start to, instrument the interactions that are occurring between these actors, again, with verifiable credentials and proofs, and those things are portable and interoperable and trustable through various governance frameworks. And we don't need like one governance framework to rule them all. We have our own in BC, but when BC says something and Canada certifies it, then through the Paris Agreement, we have a means to create trust through the governance frameworks. And so back to that stack and the dual trust. So what I find really exciting is that we can take the technologies we've been working on, with Aries and Indy and the others, and we could find some, I think, tangible, demonstrable projects. I tried to show you a little bit of one there.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we could go try to see if we can try back, go to those individual wells, because I think
I have a snapshot on the screen too. So this is an example of a well permit credential. And here's the kind of data that was in it. This is actual real data from the authoritative system. We don't yet have these credentials kind of live, if you like, but we have them in demo systems. So the idea here is that this is available through an API, so you can get the data, or if you really want it, you can ask for the cryptographic proof from this system, because the org book is actually a holder. It's a public holder. It doesn't hold credentials about itself. It holds credentials about all of the legal entities in our province. We can also issue these credentials directly to the organizations themselves. That's kind of like one of the great things about credentials, is you can create as many as you like, that makes sense.
What I find fascinating about this is, and we were talking before around, I say that there's two major double entry bookkeepings that we need to do. One's at the Earth system level, which is purely planetary. There's no such thing as boundaries. It's all one atmosphere. And the other one's the world actors. Like what we measure at the planetary level through our CO2 emissions, through our CO2 sensors, that's what's the state of the planet. So we could do clear accounting at the planetary level, but that needs to sync around how we do that accounting at the world level. And so eventually those need to match. I think it's going to be a while until we get those numbers to match. But the other one really goes down to these wells. So when we think about energy, which is around 70 to 80% of the climate problem because of the combustion of fossil fuels, we have to think in terms of upstream and downstream. And upstream is those specific wells, right? And that's a second level of double entry bookkeeping. When we look at measuring carbon, normally the protocol is called the greenhouse gas protocol, which is divided into scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 are direct emissions that an organization does. So let's say that there's emissions at the well level, but from Shell in BC. Those need to be accounted within Shell and within BC. But then once those products are sold, they go downstream. And then when I use that gas and I use it for my own operations, those are my scope 1s, right? Those are the ones that I account for. So it's very important to understand the relationship between that supply and demand as we're doing that level of accounting. So what I was explaining is that the fuel that I consume from Shell is Shell's scope 3, which is their indirect emissions. bringing in a lot more digital transformation to this whole process and transparency, which is a key part of the Paris Agreement, thanks to the interplay between different tools that you've also presented, really allows us to be able to monitor openly. And my view is that every point in the planet where anyone is extracting fossil fuels, that should be a radically transparent layer, because that is a resource that is not really owned by anyone. That's millions of years of photosynthesis trapped in plate tectonics that we just bumped into, and now we've been using it to power our economy. So as we transition the monitoring of these and the role of subnational governments, so I find this fascinating and a great opportunity for robust climate accounting pilots.
Yeah, so we can go on and on about this subject. We've already been going for a few hours, but ourselves. But so we'll have any questions that we'd like to answer, then we'd be happy to answer those.
Yeah, this is an awesome presentation. Thank you guys for doing what you're doing. So cool. I guess my question is, and I feel like you guys touched this a little bit with the different circles. Obviously, there's different metrics that need. Like there's a planetary scope, and then there's also like a regional scope too. And we're talking about like debiting and crediting carbon emissions. So my question is like, what's that 0 point where like you go over it and it's a credit, you go under it to debit? Or is that, I guess that's probably the whole issue, right? It varies geographically, or I don't know if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, so things get a bit complicated when it comes down to, for example, a carbon credit from renewable energy generated. But in general, like a debit would be your carbon emissions, provable emissions that happened. If I say there's X amount of fuel that went into your car, by the ratios of the type of fuel, we can calculate exactly how much were your emissions, right? So those are the ones that you're directly responsible for. A credit would be if you start creating, for example, land-based solutions, and the simplest ones is reforestation, planting trees. A tree would capture around a ton of carbon in its lifetime, just to keep math simple. So if there is what's called additionality, is that the trees that you've brought into are there because of the climate intent and the need for certifying it, then those can be certified and those can be used to offset, which is when often you take a flight, you're offered a credit, a carbon offset, that may have created that credit elsewhere. For example, Canada has a huge potential to be a net carbon credit issuer if it transforms its forest economy into a climate mitigation engine, right? By sequestering carbon. And things get slightly difficult when your green energy is displacing dirtier electrons, let's say. Because what you're measuring is what didn't happen, right? With the tree, if it remains and it has permanence, it will sustain there. So often you have to do those credits that are around like what would have been the business as usual, and what did we do instead. So an energy efficiency program is very important. It's like the cleanest energy is the one we don't use. So for that, we kind of have to have a benchmark of what would have been our normal consumption, and then what's our efficiency program. Now that's very important for financing, because you can even use climate bonds, which are a specific climate outcome linked financial instrument that you have to also prove like what was the climate value that you generated so that you can finance your energy efficiency program. And this is where this accounting really meets a part of the financial world.
And I think you can see then the need for both a trustable way to count things and a governance framework, right? Because when you get into situations where you're talking about like avoidance, well, that has to be somehow auditable and provable, right? It's not just a technology problem, it's a governance problem as well, right? And so, so that's kind of a very important point to all of this. It's got to be the two kinds of world working together. And And you can see that, like in some of the negotiations, that's where resistance starts to come, the transparency. So the very key thing here is that creating greater observability and integrity of industrial operations allows us to see what's happening with greater degree of certainty. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do is reduce uncertainty. We want to know what's happening. We can't make it better if we can't measure it. And companies and provinces can't attract investment or provide conditions for a healthy economy, which is our job, without knowing what's going on, and that's a big gap that we're trying to kind of start to play into.
And that level of transparency and understanding is also critical as whole industries are and will be in the process of transformation. I mean, that big peak or drop of emissions requires that a company like Shell, for example, or what falls within the group of carbon majors, needs to transform its business model yesterday if we're going to get to net zero by 2050. BP just announced their plan for aiming to net zero. So that's an entire business model transformation pathway, which requires a lot of this high degree of visibility and transparency, also a lack of financial opportunities for that to happen, and also to send signals from companies that probably are more exposed to high carbon assets that can replicate into their ESG metrics, for example, which obviously sends a signal back to investors. So this is kind of where we got really excited around kind of starting to paint a bit the picture of how this fits within the financial world. Any questions?
Yes. With this model, who would be the customer?
In our case, so in our case, part of this is just like a public good, like being able to do this. The part of the pitch for us is exactly what Martine mentioned, is there's sort of, so as a government, these organizations are undertaking an activity and they're creating pollution, which in economics we'll call a negative externality. In order to manage negative externalities, we either tax or we permit. So we limit things, right? We reduce supply. That's our tool. What I'm trying to encourage is another mechanism. And on top of that, in order for us to understand how much to tax them and how much we permit them, we create a regulatory system that's quite high friction, which is almost a third tax. So what we're trying to kind of pitch is say, let's make this easier for them to comply. We create greater observability, integrity of the system by both of us having a set of technologies that are interoperable so that we can exchange data in trustworthy ways. And because we have a fairly, in BC anyways, our competitive advantage is that we have a fairly strict regulatory environment. We actually care about emissions. We manage it the best we can, and we'd like to do better. We have government-to-government relations with First Nations, and these are things that we want to be able to give our companies proof that they're doing that so they can use that as a differentiator in the market. So the minerals and fuels and other products and sustainable energy as they move forward, they can prove to the market that this was done on land that was approved by the First Nations, that it met the regulatory frameworks, that we were measuring the climate impacts, and we can see them going down over time. And that's an advantage for them from an investor point of view, and that's an advantage for them from their supply chain point of view. Does that make sense?
From the point of our side, sorry, you had a follow-up?
Yes. So actually, I'm wondering how can we measure the emission of a company?
You measure emission of a company by looking at its entire operation, and then you start dividing by that protocol that I mentioned around scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What are direct emissions? Direct emissions would be any direct combustion, any land use change, its fleet of cars, its air use of flights. Scope 2 is the use of electricity, and scope 3 are direct emissions. So that's kind of goes back to one example of who are the clients from the open climate vision. It is everyone. It's you, because this is part of accounting to keep us in a sustainable, livable planet. So that applies to everyone. But obviously, if we think about accounting, it really also applies in terms of taxes. Everyone pays taxes, which means everyone has to have clear books, whether you're an individual, whether you're a company, or you're a state. So a robust accounting structure unleashes a lot of financial opportunities, but also creates different mechanisms for operation for the entire economy, right?
I think we might get kicked out. I don't know if there's a talk next, but fire.
Really fascinating. Just one question. How much pushback do you get? Because we do agree in principle we are right and you get it right by, let's say, 92.5%. And it's a model, so there are some uncertainties. But do you see that it's actually, because when I look at some of the green finance initiatives and so on, all the data that we currently have, because we don't not have traceable elements of DLT or whatever, is by the company reporting themselves, and
Right.
it's basically
We're doing good.
it's
Promise. I
very difficult
promise.
to get that. But how much pushback do you actually get for not being accurate 100%, but being accurate only 95%? Because I'll give you an example. Someone could argue about carbon capture. I offset it now that you didn't account for. Or if you have a methanol plant that all of a sudden evapes and all of a sudden CO2 is a little bit higher. But do you see that's no longer an issue in 2020 because the problem is so big? Or do you still see some of the companies actually saying, yes, but your model is not perfect?
When you mean your model...
your prediction that maybe 2020 being the tipping point in October versus January 2021.
Yeah, so, I mean, that goes back to climate science, right? And running integrative assessment models. I think at the international level, these type of numbers are well established because we also need to have heuristics. You can run integrated. So when we say, here's our remaining carbon budget, this is, we're talking about the planetary level, and here's our goal for net zero 2050, that is because we've run multiple general circulation models of planet Earth multiple times. There's supercomputers that have to run this. And there's different ways of creating those models. But the main vehicle to compare them is called the CMIP6 Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. That feeds into the IPCC. The IPCC looks at the entire climate science and brings down a very clear scientific information to the UNFCCC, the UN level. So all of this is quite robust. I mean, if you could say, well, you've peaked in June, that is true, but the more you delay, the more you'll have to sequester later.
I can say, like, I was in the room with Canada's chief climate negotiator and the head of a very large company's climate advisor, and after the talks in December that didn't result in the rule book for Article 6, and they're meeting to say, they were disappointed that the rule book wasn't established, but they're continuing to act as if it is. Because it doesn't matter like about January or June or whatever, they know this has to happen, and they're trying to continue to take actions to make, to reach the ability to say, for example, trade mitigation outcomes, because they know they can't reduce things globally without some exchange.
This is a huge opportunity because there's nuances in the numbers, but there's also leadership for stewardship. So when a company says, irrespective of those nuances, we want to take a robust stance on climate, because with a changing generation, we know that our license to operate to the broader mainstream world, we need to show that degrees of robust leadership and stewardship. So when companies take that action, where it's like, we want to do it, if the guardrail is 2050, we want to do it by 2040. But obviously, that's where a lot of what we're working on is to be able to have a robust accounting at all of those nested actor levels. And I think that's really what we need is the ambitious goals and changing from point of like different opportunities in the system to really a clear leadership and stewardship from all organizations.
So, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.